Growing up, I always felt like an outsider in my own family. My sister Emily, the golden child, was everything my parents wanted: perfect, accomplished, and effortlessly blending into their world. Meanwhile, I, Michelle, was the black sheep, the odd one out who never quite fit in. From a young age, it was clear that Emily and I were worlds apart. She thrived in the spotlight, adored by our parents, while I struggled to find my place in a family that seemed to speak a language I could never understand. Our conversations were always superficial, filled with polite nods and quick dismissals whenever I tried to share my interests. Over time, I stopped trying altogether. It was easier to fade into the background than to face their indifference. When I left for college, the distance between us only grew. I rarely returned home, opting to spend holidays with my grandparents or traveling instead. It wasn't out of spite, it was self-preservation. Every visit home felt like stepping into a stranger's life, where I was treated more like a guest than a daughter or sister. The coldness was palpable. My parents never reached out, never asked how I was doing, and Emily? She seemed perfectly content with my absence, as if my departure had finally given her the undivided attention she craved. It hurt more than I cared to admit. Family is supposed to notice when you're slipping away, but mine didn't seem to care. They were too busy basking in Emily's achievements to notice the daughter who was quietly drowning in loneliness. The breaking point came during a rare family dinner last Christmas. For the first time in years, I didn't feel entirely invisible thanks to Jonathan, Emily's fiancé. He treated me like a person, engaging me in conversation about my life, my studies, and my dreams. It was a small gesture, but it meant the world to me. Emily, however, didn't see it that way. Her icy glares and passive-aggressive comments made it clear she was threatened by the mere idea of someone paying attention to me. That night, she cornered me and accused me of trying to steal Jonathan, claiming I was jealous of her perfect life. I was stunned. How could she twist a simple act of kindness into something so malicious? Her words cut deep, not because they were true, but because they revealed just how little she thought of me. From that moment on, the rift between us became a chasm. Emily's hostility grew, and my parents, as always, took her side without question. Their subtle jabs and dismissive attitudes only reinforced what I'd always known. I didn't belong in their world. The pain of being rejected by your own family is a wound that never fully heals. And as the days turned into weeks, I realized I was done trying to earn their love. I was done being the scapegoat, the problem child, the one who could never measure up. Little did I know this was only the beginning of a storm that would tear our family apart. The tension that had been simmering beneath the surface of our family finally boiled over when Emily announced her engagement to Jonathan. It should have been a joyous occasion, a moment for celebration, but for me, it was just another reminder of how disconnected I was from my own family. I found out about the engagement through my grandparents, not even from Emily herself. The sting of that betrayal was sharp, but by then I had grown accustomed to being an afterthought. Still, a small part of me held on to the hope that, despite everything, Emily might extend an olive branch and invite me to her wedding. After all, we were sisters, weren't we? But that hope was shattered when Emily called me out of the blue. Her voice cold and detached to deliver the blow. I wasn't invited to the wedding. Her reasoning was as absurd as it was hurtful. She claimed that Jonathan had feelings for me and that my presence would make the day uncomfortable. I laughed, not because it was funny, but because it was so utterly ridiculous. Jonathan and I had barely spoken more than a handful of times, and even then, it was nothing more than polite conversation. The idea that he could have any romantic interest in me was laughable, but Emily's paranoia had taken root, and there was no reasoning with her. I hung up the phone, feeling a mix of anger and relief. Anger at the audacity of her accusation, and relief that I wouldn't have to endure the charade of pretending to be a happy family for her special day. But the drama didn't end there. Just days before the wedding, my phone exploded with frantic calls from my parents. Jonathan, it seemed, had discovered that I wasn't invited, and he was furious. At the rehearsal dinner in front of everyone, he confronted Emily, demanding to know why she would exclude her own sister. When she tried to justify her decision, Jonathan dropped a bombshell. He refused to marry her. His words were like a thunderclap, shaking the foundation of our already fragile family. He said he couldn't be part of a family that treated one of its own with such cruelty and disdain. For the first time in my life, someone had seen through the facade and called out the toxicity that had always surrounded me. Emily, desperate to salvage her crumbling relationship, begged me to come and fix things. She wanted me to lie to tell Jonathan that I had chosen not to attend the wedding, as if that would erase months of her accusations and exclusion. But I refused. I was done being the scapegoat, the one who had to clean up the messes others created. Jonathan's decision to walk away wasn't just about me, it was about the kind of person Emily had become, and the family that had enabled her behavior. The wedding was called off, and the fallout was catastrophic. Emily was devastated, my parents were in chaos, and I was left to pick up the pieces of a life I had never truly been a part of. The storm had finally hit, and nothing would ever be the same. The fallout from Jonathan's decision to call off the wedding was nothing short of explosive. Overnight, I became the villain in a story I never asked to be part of. My family, desperate to salvage what was left of Emily's shattered dreams, turned their anger and blame squarely on me. It was as if I had orchestrated the entire disaster, as if my mere existence was enough to ruin their perfect lives. The calls started pouring in first from my parents, their voices trembling with a mix of desperation and accusation. "Michelle, you need to fix this," my father demanded, as if I held some magical power to undo the damage they had caused. My mother's pleas were even more suffocating, her tears dripping with guilt-tripping words about family loyalty and sisterly love. But where was that loyalty when I was the one being pushed aside? Emily, in her typical dramatic fashion, took things to a whole new level. She called me, her voice a chaotic blend of sobs and rage, demanding that I come to the rehearsal dinner and clear up the misunderstanding. She wanted me to lie, to tell Jonathan that I had chosen not to attend the wedding, as if that would somehow erase the months of exclusion and accusation she had thrown at me. The audacity of it all was staggering. After treating me like a pariah, after blaming me for her fiancé's doubts, she now expected me to be her savior. I could almost hear the unspoken words in her tone. "This is your fault, Michelle. Fix it." But I was done playing the role of the family scapegoat. For years, I had been the one to bear the weight of their dysfunction, the one who was always expected to apologize, to compromise, to disappear when it was convenient. Not this time. When I refused to comply, but backlash was immediate and vicious. Emily's friends and even distant relatives began bombarding me with messages, accusing me of being selfish, heartless, and worse. My parents, instead of defending me, joined the chorus, their passive-aggressive comments cutting deeper than any outright insult. "You've always been difficult," my mother said, her voice dripping with disappointment. "Why can't you just do this one thing for your sister?" The isolation was suffocating. It felt like the entire world had turned against me, all because I had chosen to stand my ground. But amidst the chaos, there was a strange sense of clarity. For the first time, I could see the truth for what it was. My family's love was conditional, their acceptance a prize I could never earn. Jonathan's decision to walk away wasn't just about Emily. It was about the toxic dynamic that had defined our family for years. And while I knew the road ahead would be lonely, I also knew I couldn't go back to being the person they wanted me to be. The storm had exposed the cracks in our foundation, and there was no repairing what had been broken. The moment I hung up the phone after Emily's desperate plea for me to fix her ruined wedding, I felt a strange mix of emotions, relief, anger, and a quiet sense of empowerment. For years, I had been the invisible one, the problem child, the scapegoat for every family drama. But this time, I refused to play my part. I wouldn't lie to Jonathan, I wouldn't pretend that everything was fine, and I certainly wouldn't sacrifice my own dignity to save Emily's crumbling relationship. The decision was mine, and for the first time, I felt like I was in control of my own life. Jonathan's reaction was the final nail in the coffin. When he learned that I had been banned from the wedding, he didn't just walk away, he made a statement. At the rehearsal dinner in front of everyone, he called out Emily and my family for their toxic behavior. His words were like a spotlight, exposing the cracks in our family's carefully constructed facade. "I can't marry into a family that treats one of their own like this," he said, his voice steady but filled with disappointment. The room fell silent, the weight of his words hanging in the air like a storm cloud. Emily's face turned pale, and my parents looked as though they'd been struck by lightning. It was a moment of reckoning, one that no one saw coming. The fallout was immediate and brutal. Emily, once the golden child, was now a broken mess, her perfect life unraveling before her eyes. She called me again, her voice trembling with a mix of anger and desperation, begging me to come and explain things to Jonathan. But I stood my ground. "This is your mess, Emily," I told her, my voice calm but firm. "You made your choices, and now you have to live with them." Her response was a torrent of tears and accusations, but I didn't waver. For once, I wasn't going to be the one to clean up after her. My parents, of course, took her side. They called me relentlessly, their voices filled with a mix of guilt and frustration. "Michelle, you're tearing this family apart," my father said, as if I were the one who had created the chaos. My mother's pleas were even more manipulative, her words dripping with false concern. "Think about your sister's feelings," she said, as if mine had never mattered. But I was done listening. I turned off my phone, made myself a cup of tea, and sat down to process everything that had happened. For the first time in years, I felt a sense of peace. The storm had finally hit, and while it had left destruction in its wake, it had also cleared the air. Jonathan's decision to walk away wasn't just about Emily. It was about the kind of person he was, someone who valued integrity and kindness over appearances. His actions validated everything I had felt for years, that my family's behavior was toxic and that I deserved better. As I sat there, sipping my tea and listening to the silence, I realized that this was the beginning of a new chapter. The old Michelle, the one who had always tried to please everyone, was gone. In her place was someone stronger, someone who refused to be a pawn in someone else's game. The crisis wasn't over, but for the first time, I felt ready to face whatever came next. The fallout from the canceled wedding didn't just end with Emily's tears and my family's guilt-tripping. It escalated into something far darker and more dangerous. Emily, unable to accept that her actions had consequences, launched a full-blown campaign of harassment and revenge against me. It started small, with passive-aggressive comments on social media and anonymous messages filled with venomous accusations. But it didn't take long for her behavior to spiral out of control. One morning, I walked out to my car and found it vandalized, eggs splattered across the windshield, the tires slashed, and a note taped to the driver's side window. The handwriting was unmistakably Emily's. "You ruined my life. Now I'll ruin yours." I was shaken but not surprised. This was classic Emily, dramatic, vindictive, and utterly incapable of taking responsibility for her own mistakes. What had surprised me, however, was the sheer audacity of her actions. Over the next few weeks, the harassment intensified. My mailbox was destroyed, my apartment door defaced with offensive graffiti, and I even caught her on my security camera attempting to break into my home in the middle of the night. It was like watching a train wreck in slow motion, horrifying yet impossible to look away from. My parents, of course, dismissed her behavior as just Emily being Emily. Their refusal to hold her accountable only fueled her sense of entitlement. But I wasn't the same Michelle who would have let this slide in the past. Thanks to the advice I'd received from the Reddit community, I had installed security cameras and meticulously documented every incident. I saved every threatening message, took photos of the damage, and even recorded phone calls where Emily's rage was on full display. When I finally took all of this evidence to a lawyer, they were appalled. "This isn't just harassment," they said. "This is criminal behavior." Armed with a mountain of proof, I filed a restraining order and pressed charges against Emily. The court case was swift and decisive. Emily, who had always been so confident in her ability to manipulate her way out of trouble, was blindsided when the judge handed down a permanent restraining order, mandated therapy, and a 1-year suspended sentence. The security footage of her attempting to break into my apartment was particularly damning, and even her lawyer couldn't spin it in her favor. My parents, predictably, were furious not at Emily for her actions, but at me for destroying her life. Their loyalty to her was unwavering, even in the face of overwhelming evidence that she was in the wrong. The aftermath was bittersweet. On one hand, I felt a sense of justice I hadn't known was possible. Emily's reign of terror was over, and for the first time she was being held accountable for her actions. On the other hand, the experience had severed any remaining ties I had with my family. Their refusal to see the truth, their willingness to excuse Emily's behavior, was the final confirmation that I would never be a priority to them. But as I stood there, looking at the restraining order in my hands, I realized something important. I didn't need their approval anymore. I had taken control of my life, and no amount of their toxicity could take that away from me. The storm had passed, and I was still standing. After the storm of Emily's harassment and the legal battle that followed, I finally reached a turning point. The chaos had left me exhausted, but it also gave me clarity. I realized that the only way to truly move forward was to leave the past behind completely. I packed up my life, moved to a new apartment in a secure building, and shut down all my social media accounts. It was a fresh start, a chance to rebuild my life on my own terms, free from the toxicity that had defined my family for so long. For the first time in years, I felt a sense of peace. The weight of their expectations, their judgments, and their constant need to blame me for everything was finally lifted. The support I received from the Reddit community during this time was nothing short of life-changing. When I felt like I was drowning in self-doubt, their encouraging messages reminded me that I wasn't alone. They celebrated my victories, no matter how small, and helped me see that walking away from my family wasn't a failure, it was an act of self-preservation. Their advice on documenting Emily's harassment and taking legal action gave me the tools I needed to stand up for myself. Without them, I might have stayed trapped in the cycle of guilt and blame. Now, as I sit in my new apartment, surrounded by the quiet hum of a life I've built for myself, I feel a sense of freedom I never thought possible. I'm no longer the black sheep, the scapegoat, or the problem child. I'm just Michelle, someone who's learning to prioritize her own happiness and well-being. The road ahead isn't without its challenges, but for the first time, I feel equipped to face them. To everyone who supported me, thank you. You gave me the strength to break free, and for that, I'll always be grateful. This chapter of my life is over, and I'm ready to write a new one. As I reflect on everything that's happened, one thing has become crystal clear. Setting boundaries is not just important, it's essential. For years, I allowed my family to dictate my worth, to blame me for their problems, and to treat me as though I were disposable. But the moment I decided to stand up for myself, to say, no more, everything changed. It wasn't easy. Walking away from the people who were supposed to love and support me unconditionally was one of the hardest things I've ever done. But it was also the most liberating. I've learned that family isn't just about blood, it's about respect, kindness, and mutual support. And when those things are absent, it's okay to walk away. My journey taught me that toxic relationships, no matter who they're with, will only drain you if you let them. By setting boundaries and demanding respect, I reclaimed my life. Emily's harassment, my parents' indifference, and the years of being the scapegoat could have broken me, but instead they made me stronger. I realized that I didn't need their approval to be happy. I didn't need to fix their problems or carry their guilt. All I needed was to prioritize myself. To anyone out there struggling with toxic family dynamics, my message is this: you deserve better. You deserve to be treated with respect, to have your feelings validated, and to live a life free from manipulation and blame. Walking away doesn't mean you failed, it means you've chosen to value yourself. And that, more than anything, is the ultimate act of self-love. This chapter of my life is closed, but the lessons I've learned will stay with me forever. Here's to new beginnings, to peace, and to living life on your own terms.